Good day everyone. In this presentation, we will be discussing about Sikolohiyang Pilipino, which is the legacy of Virgilio Enriquez. Let us now proceed to learning the background of our topic. Now, the beginnings of Sikolohiyang Pilipino were pretty much the same with the developments of other disciplines where we found a problem, and we see that the establishment of such discipline is the solution. For the case of Sikolohiyang Pilipino, Enriquez found that the current psychology, which has a Western approach, is problematic due to the following arguments. As a colonized nation, we were seen by the colonizers as a weaker race, and so traditions and behaviors that are different to them are derogatorily described. So interpretations of Filipino behavior are pejorative and characterized from a judgmental and impressionistic perspective of colonizers. Also, since Western theories and methodology are culture-bound to Western experience, the Filipino image has been inaccurately defined, if not distorted. Lastly, Western categories and standards made Western behavior patterns as models for Filipino. Because of this, Filipinos struggle to find and assert our national identity. Now, all of these problems mainly point that the current psychology fails to cover the nuances of Filipino culture or even as big as Asian culture, which questions its appropriateness and applicability in a third world setting. So the solution to this is to develop a psychology covering Filipino culture and that which is viewed and explained from a Filipino lens. Of course, who can better understand Filipino behavior but us Filipinos? Now, let us proceed to familiarizing Sikolohiyang Pilipino. So what is Sikolohiyang Pilipino? It is described as psychology anchored on Filipino thought and experience as understood from a Filipino perspective. Later, it was defined by Enriquez as a study of diwa or psyche, which in Filipino directly refers to the following thoughts. One is the wealth of ideas referred to by the philosophical concept of essence, meaning what is innate and natural to us. Second is the range of psychological concepts such as awareness, motives, and behavior. So the development of Sikolohiyang Pilipino was done through two types of indigenization. One is indigenization from without, which is based largely on simple translation of concepts, methods, theories, and measures into the Filipino language. For example, psychological tests were translated into the local language and modified in content so that a Philippine type version of the originally borrowed test was produced. However, this approach failed to capture or express a truly Filipino psychology. So the second indigenization, which is indigenization from within, was given more emphasis. From the word itself, it means looking for the indigenous psychology from within the culture. It is better termed as cultural revalidation by Enriquez, since the term indigenization is considered to be erroneous as how can you indigenize something that is already indigenous. Now, much of the strategy for establishing Sikolohiyang Pilipino were based on assessment of historical and socio-cultural realities, understanding the local language, and unraveling the Filipino characteristics and explaining them through the eyes of the native Filipino. This kind of strategy produced a psychology which is appropriate and significant to Filipinos. Sikolohiyang Pilipino will be further explained in the next discussions, but first let us get to know Virgilio Enriquez as the pioneer of Sikolohiyang Pilipino and a figure in psychology. So Enriquez was adept in the Filipino language as he was trained by his father in speaking the native language fluently since childhood. For instance, he was frequently engaged in Filipino discussions, translate daily paper to Filipino, and even made to explain his English written PhD dissertation to his father in Filipino. As an authority in psychology, Enriquez formally started career in psychology in 1963 when he started teaching at UP. As early as 1965, he was already using Filipino in teaching. Then he pursued his master's and doctoral degree in social psychology at Northwestern University in USA. His journey on developing Filipino psychology started during his years studying abroad as he perceived the deteriorating political and social conditions of the country. As we all know, this is during Marcos' reign. During that time, nationalism was a large phenomenon in the Philippines that it affects the form of teaching at UP, and one aspect of that is the use of Filipino language. Through his correspondence with Dr. Alfredo V. Lagmay, then chairman of the Department of Psychology of UP, Enriquez learned that the matter of teaching in the Filipino language was being taken up eagerly. Enriquez then started preparing for the teaching of psychology in Filipino and even had discussions with friends and professors at Northwestern University. Enriquez returned to the Philippines in 1971, where he applied his knowledge in developing a Filipino-oriented approach in teaching and research. He then later established the Philippine Psychology Research House, which later became the Philippine Psychology Research and Training House. He then became chairman of the Department of Psychology at UP from 1977 to 1982. Of course, he also taught and shared his knowledge at other institutions. And these are the publications he made and the achievements and awards he obtained from his contributions to society with Sikolohiyang Pilipino.
Sikolohiyang Pilipino has basic elements and features. Let us first define the term Sikolohiyang Pilipino. Sikolohiyang Pilipino, or Filipino psychology, differs from Sikolohiya sa Pilipinas, or psychology in the Philippines, and Sikolohiya ng mga Pilipino, or psychology of the Filipinos. Sikolohiya sa Pilipinas refers to the general form of psychology in the Philippines, while Sikolohiya ng mga Pilipino is about the theory behind the psychological nature of Filipinos in a local or foreign perspective. There are 4 affiliations of Sikolohiyang Pilipino, according to Zuz Salazar. Salazar, a friend of Enriquez, is a historian that studied the history of psychology in the Philippines and came up with descriptions of 4 affiliations of Philippine psychology. The academic scientific psychology coincided with the birth of scientific psychology and the entry of Western psychology at Philippine universities. The academic philosophical psychology is pursued by UST and later other schools of higher learning under the leadership of individual monks, preachers, and the Jesuits. It continued in the tradition of Thomistic philosophy and psychology. The ethnic psychology is the major basis of Sikolohiyang Pilipino for the integration of the first 2 psychologies into a national tradition of psychology and philosophy as universal disciplines. This includes indigenous psychology, psychology of the Filipinos, and the practice of psychology by Filipinos. The last affiliation is the psychomedical system, with religion as its cohesive element and explanation. Enriquez identified the major characteristics of Sikolohiyang Pilipino as an indigenous Asian psychology. In terms of its philosophical antecedents, it includes empirical philosophy, academic scientific psychology, the ideas and teachings of Ricardo Pascual, and logical analysis of language, as well as rational philosophy, the clerical tradition, phenomenology, Thomistic philosophy and psychology, along with liberalism, the Philippine propaganda movement, the writings of Philippine heroes Jacinto, Mabini, and Del Pilar, and ethnic psychology. The other characteristics are divided into principal emphasis, method of investigation, areas of protest, psychological practice, science humanism issue, mentalism behavioralism issue, and analysis wholeness issue. For Sikolohiyang Pilipino's principal emphasis, it focuses on identity and national consciousness, social awareness and involvement, psychology of language and culture, and applications and basis of Filipino psychology in health practices, agriculture, art, mass media, and religion, among others. The principal methods of investigation used are the following: cross-indigenous method, multi-method, multi-language approach, appropriate field methods, and total approach or the triangulation method. For areas of protests, Sikolohiyang Pilipino is against a psychology that perpetuates the colonial status of the Filipino mind. It is also against a psychology used for the exploitation of the masses. Lastly, it is against the imposition to a third world country of psychologies developed in industrial countries. Psychological practices of Sikolohiyang Pilipino includes conceptualization of psychological practice in a Philippine context. For example, livelihood psychology instead of industrial psychology, health psychology instead of clinical psychology. It is also concerned with folk practices or indigenous techniques of healing, popular religio-political movements, and community or rural psychology. For the science-humanism issue, Sikolohiyang Pilipino is concerned with both scientific and humanistic approaches to develop a psychology as a science and psychology as an art. Regarding the mentalism-behaviorism issue, Sikolohiyang Pilipino admits both, with greater emphasis on the collective experience of a people with a common bond of history rather than individual experiences. It puts greater importance to the kamalayan or psyche rather than the ulirat or lower level of physical consciousness. Regarding the analysis wholeness issue, Sikolohiyang Pilipino methodologically is on the side of analysis, but aims to interpret the result of analysis with a bias for wholeness. Sikolohiyang Pilipino, as a liberated and interdisciplinary psychology, aims to eliminate its bondage to the Western-rooted theory, method, and practice in psychology. It also aims to turn clinical psychology and industrial psychology into health psychology, livelihood psychology, rural psychology, and psychology of the arts. It aims to be more responsible and responsive to the needs of the Filipino people.
Development of indigenous concepts and theories. There is a good deal of literature on the Filipino personality which has become available. The Filipino personality is a popular area of study of many foreign scholars who came to the Philippines. Using language interpreters and without really immersing themselves in the culture of the people, these foreign experts have published their versions of Filipino values. These depictions filtered into the textbooks of the Philippine educational system, which was already greatly influenced by Western ideas to begin with. These Filipino values, together with other colonial interpretations offered by the foreign scholars, have been transmitted from one generation to another, thus perpetuating a distorted, if not false, picture of the Filipino. Enriquez encouraged Filipino scholars to take a second look at these values using a Filipino orientation. Social scientists such as Lagmay, Salazar, and Bonifacio took up the challenge in their own research. Here are some of these Filipino values from the exogenous and indigenous perspectives. The first one is Bahalana. The Filipino cultural value of Bahalana has no exact English translation. Bostrom was the first one to analyze this value by comparing it with American fatalism, which was obviously a pervasive interpretation that when Thomas Andres published his Dictionary of Filipino Culture and Values, he still defines it as the Filipino attitude that makes him accept sufferings and problems, leaving everything to God. For example, bahala na ang Diyos, or God will take care of us, which was this attitude is a fatalistic resignation or withdrawal from an engagement or crisis, or a shirking from personal responsibility. The Sikolohiyang Filipino perspective interprets bahalana differently. Lagmay explained that bahalana is not fatalism, but determination and risk-taking. When Filipinos express, "Bahala na," they are not leaving their faith to God and remaining passive. Rather, they are telling themselves that they are ready to face the difficult situation before them and will do their best to achieve their objectives. The expression is a way of pumping courage into their system so that they do not buckle down. Next is hiya. American scholar Sibley translated hiya as shame. Another American saw hiya as the uncomfortable feeling that accompanies awareness of being in a socially unacceptable position or performing a socially unacceptable action. For example, when an employee is scolded in front of other people. To add to the negativity of this interpretation, Andres described hiya as an ingredient in why Filipinos overspend during fiestas in order to please their visitors, even to the extent of going into debt. This conventional interpretation of hiya is inadequate because it does not take into account the importance of understanding how affixations in Philippine languages can give a new meaning to a word. Bonifacio alerted us to the different meanings of the word hiya depending on its form. Nakakahiya, which means embarrassing; napahiya, which means placed in an awkward position; ikinahiya, which means be embarrassed with someone. With some affixes, it becomes negative, for example, napahiya. With others positive, like mahiyain or shy. And in still other forms, it can either be positive or negative depending on the context. For example, kahihiyan or sense of propriety or embarrassment. Evidently, it is the external aspect which foreign scholars have captured. After all is said and done, the more appropriate translation of hiya in English is not shame, but sense of propriety. Third is utang na loob. Utang na loob was translated by Kaut as debt of gratitude. Andres, following Kaut's logic, defines it as the principle of reciprocity incurred when an individual helps another. Hans Steiner took this interpretation further by claiming that the recipient of the favor is forced to show his gratitude properly by returning the favor with interest. But looking at utang na loob more closely in the context of Filipino culture, it actually means gratitude or solidarity. It is not necessarily a burden as the word debt connotes, because in the Filipino pattern of interpersonal relations, there is always an opportunity to return a favor. It is in fact expressed in a popular Filipino saying, "Ang hindi lumingon sa pinanggalingan ay hindi makakarating sa paroroonan." Those who do not look back to where they came from will not reach their destination. Utang na loob is a calling heard by many Filipinos who go to other lands but who still retain strong ties with their homeland. Pakikisama versus pakikipagkapwa. Pakikisama was identified by Lynch as a Filipino value, giving it the English translation of maintaining smooth interpersonal relations by going along with the group or the majority decision, that is, conformity. Enriquez unfolds the concept of Kapwa, or shared identity, which is at the core of Filipino social psychology and which is at the heart of the structure of Filipino values. He discovers that it is not maintaining smooth interpersonal relationships that Filipinos are most concerned with, but pakikipagkapwa, which means treating the other person as kapwa or fellow human being. There are two categories of kapwa: the ibang tao, or the outsider, and the hindi ibang tao, or the one of us. In Filipino social interaction, one is immediately placed into one of these two categories, and how one is placed determines the level of interaction one is shown. For example, if one is regarded as ibang tao, the interaction can range from pakikitungo to pakikisalamuha to pakikilahok to pakikibagay and to pakikisama. If one is categorized as hindi ibang tao, then you can expect pakikipagpalagayang loob, or pakikisangkot, or the highest level of pakikiisa. Using the Sikolohiyang Filipino perspective, Enriquez reconceptualized the Filipino behavior patterns and value structure. Thus, the area of Filipino personality developed as a strong area using the Sikolohiyang Filipino perspective. The Filipino is a blend of East and West. The Western influence can be seen more in external ways: dressing, liking for hamburger and other food, Western music, and dance. However, the internal aspect, which is at the core of his pagkatao or personality, is Asian. Deference for authority, modesty or humility, concern for others, and etc. Indirect communication. Another aspect of Filipino personality that was given attention by the Sikolohiyang Filipino perspective is the propensity for indirect communication. Part of our socialization is being sensitive to nonverbal cues, which has made the sharpening of pakikiramdam, or shared inner perception, which is a particularly desirable skill in many situations involving Filipino social interaction. Pakikiramdam is a request to feel or to be sensitive to. It is a shared feeling, a kind of emotional priority. There is a hesitation to react, attention to subtle cues, a nonverbal behavior in mental role-playing. The indirect pattern of communication of Filipinos has thus resulted in indirectness or euphemisms in verbal exchange, expressive body language, voice intonations that say more than the words themselves, and other similar behaviors. Internality Externality. Through his analysis of indigenous history and culture of the Filipinos, Salazar points out the internality externality component in the Filipino personality. The Filipino language has two words for the English word honor: puri and dangal. Puri refers to honor which is physical, such as that bestowed through compliments or applauses for a good performance, thus external. It can also refer to virginity, which is a virtue expected of unmarried Filipino women. Dangal is honor from within, knowledge of one's true worth, character, achievement, and success. It can be acknowledged through an award or a tribute, but even without such gestures from outside, it is within you. Thus, a poor person who is a kind and honest person and respects the dignity of hard work has a lot of dangal. Another examples of internality externality include saya and ligaya for the English word happiness, pigil and timpe for control, and dama and damdam for feel. This is not to say that this internal-external dimension is unique to the Filipinos, but this is something researchers should be conscious of when trying to understand the Filipino personality. The Great Cultural Divide. Enriquez also explored the idea of a great cultural divide in the analysis of Filipino personality. On one side of the cultural divide are Filipinos who have maintained a more mass-oriented worldview, culture, and way of life. They read the comics, listen to soap operas on radio, or watch it on television, or visit the indigenous healers for both physical and mental or emotional ailments. On the other side of the cultural divide are the Filipinos who have adhered to a more elitist viewpoint. They go to performances and cultural centers and theaters, and they look down on people on the other side of the divide. Development of indigenous personality measures. In the area of Filipino personality, Enriquez together with PPRH developed PUP, the Panukat ng Ugali at Pagkatao, or the Measure of Character and Personality, in 1975, which utilized dimensions of personality that are relevant to Filipinos. While psychological testing is of Western origin, the substance of the PUP originated from understanding of the Filipinos. Filipino personality test development efforts have in fact come a long way, as can be seen in the history of psychological measurement in the Philippines. Reviews on the status of Philippine psychological measurement in the 1970s and 1980s pointed out the twin problem of the inapplicability of foreign-made tests and the dearth of locally developed tests. Carlotta noted several trends in personality measurement, citing developments in the areas of personality testing and the measurement of abilities and aptitudes and of deviant behavior. Cypress Ortega and Guzon La Peña documented and organized the information on both published and unpublished work in the area of psychological measurement and saw a recent upsurge in the development of indigenous psychological measures. And in the 1990s, tests were developed to measure a wide variety of Filipino characteristics. In the history of Philippine psychological measurement, Enriquez Panukat ng Pagkatao clearly stands out as one of the first, if not the first, instruments that are culturally sensitive in its assessment of the Filipino personality. Development of indigenous research methods. There are at least 5 basic guiding principles relevant to the use of indigenous perspective in general and indigenous research methods in particular. First, the level of interaction or relationship that exists between the researcher and the people being researched. Second, research participants should always be treated by researchers as equal. Third, the welfare of the research participants takes precedence over the data obtained from them. Fourth, the method to be used in a research should be chosen on the basis of appropriateness to the population. And fifth, the language of the people should be the language of research at all times. Some of the indigenous research methods that have been identified are pagtatanong-tanong, pagkikipagkwentuhan, ginabayang talakayan, nakikiugaling pagmamasid, pakikisama, pagdalaw-dalaw, and panunuluyan.
The impact on the teaching of psychology in the Philippines could be seen by following Sikolohiyang Pilipino movement and the series of changes it brought not just to the field of education but also to research and publications. It started in 1970 when Professors Freddegusto David and Abariles Torres taught psychology in Filipino at UP. By the following year, Enriquez translated psychological materials into Filipino and set up a library of Philippine psychology at PPRTH. The first Masters in Psychology thesis in Filipino was written by Amelia Alfonso in 1972. By 1978, Sikolohiyang Pilipino integrated as a separate graduate course and as a subject in undergraduate level, where students compiled materials into a book called Sikolohiyang Pilipino, Teorya, Metodo, at Gamit. There were 2 other compilations published by the year 1982, followed by the publication of Sikolohiyang Pilipino, Issue, Pananaw, at Kaalaman, edited by Alan Aganon and Maria Assumpta David in 1985. In May 1990, the first 2 dissertations were defended by Danilo Tuazon on brain lateralization and Grace Aguiling Dalisay on the concept of peace among children. Enriquez published The Indigenous Psychology, a book of readings, and the Pambansang Samahan sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino published their conference proceedings in 1992. By the year 1994 and 1996, the first graduates to receive their PhD with Philippine psychology as the area of concentration were Elizabeth Portasio Marcelino and Silvia Estrada Claudio, respectively.
There are several areas where Sikolohiyang Pilipino has been applied. First, it promotes the use of local language in teaching, research, and various talks and on mass media platforms. Second, it provides psychological support to children in difficult situations, such as children in armed conflict, street children, prostituted youngsters, and etc. Feminist psychology, social, and clinical psychologists have supported battered women in understanding their difficulties in the various socio-cultural circumstances affecting women in Philippine society. And in the industry, through Sikolohiyang Pilipino, companies have also become more aware of employing a management style acceptable to Filipinos.
The debates revolving around Sikolohiyang Pilipino mainly consist of points raised by different critics to test the credibility and validity of the subject. So first, let us talk about Zeus Salazar, who raised the issue of Filipino Americans and criticized Enriquez for including them in the discourse of Sikolohiyang Pilipino. He argued that Filipino Americans are not Filipinos since they are not legitimate culture bearers. Since they are born in the US, they do not share the Philippine cultural experience and hardly speak any Philippine language. Salazar asserted that Sikolohiyang Pilipino should focus on the life experiences of people immersed in Philippine life and culture. Filipino Americans do not have a national consciousness because they are outsiders and unable to participate in national discourse which shapes consciousness. He also pointed that Enriquez contradicts himself in his pro-Filipino convictions by writing in English for a Western audience. In his response, Enriquez called Salazar's pantayong pananaw as an abashly emic or having no cross-cultural focus. He also labeled Salazar's position as reactionary ethnocentrism, which limits his views to the confines of national boundaries. For Enriquez, Filipino Americans are Filipinos because some aspects of their identity and cultural experiences are still Filipino. Now for Patricio Marcelino, she responded to the Filipino American topic in her PhD dissertation on ethnicity and identity issues of second-generation Filipino Americans. She emphasized that Filipino Americans are indeed not Filipino. They are both Filipino and American. Although they have different cultural experiences, they can still claim Filipino cultural identity since both parents are Filipino and some still speak or at least understand one Philippine language. Filipino Americans share similar values that Filipinos in the Philippines care for, such as respect for elders, sense of family and community, value for education, appreciation of the language, etc. Filipino Americans are outsiders to everyday Philippine experience, but are insiders to some critical elements of Philippine life and culture, as transmitted by their parents and reinforced during regular visits to the country. Now, Madeline Avila Santa Maria critically analyzed and pointed several areas of debate. These two topics here were among the most significant. In each, she has described the contradicting views of Enriquez and Salazar. In terms of psychology and culture, Salazar believed that psychology is necessarily part of culture, so there should be a psychological tradition in Philippine culture before one can say there is such a concept as Sikolohiyang Pilipino. In contrast, Enriquez believed that culture is derived from the process of discovering individual psychological elements and themes, so Sikolohiyang Pilipino exists as long as there are Filipinos. It just only needs to be explored and given importance. For Robert Tanco, he questioned the universality of Sikolohiyang Pilipino, asserting that it has no sufficient proof of its contribution to universal knowledge or proof that such knowledge exists in any given culture. He also implied that Sikolohiyang Pilipino's phenomenological orientation is not scientific. Of course, Enriquez defended Sikolohiyang Pilipino with his response shown here. Now, Silvia Estrada Claudio also questioned the methodology of Sikolohiyang Pilipino, but also proposed the acknowledgement of positive elements in mainstream culture and psychology. Now, the remaining two, Ortega and Guanzon La Peña, significantly contributed to Sikolohiyang Pilipino by tackling the concepts of pakikipagkwentuhan and grassroots Filipino leadership, respectively. There is still no resolution to these debates, but the fact that Sikolohiyang Pilipino still continues and interests many validates its place in psychology and the social sciences.
Universal psychology is founded on the psychology of the West, industrialized and developed countries, applying Western theories and methodologies to non Western countries and cultures. It highlights what is directly observable, measurable, and quantifiable. It is considered that all people are the same and that their context in time and space is irrelevant. As a result, it became known as the psychology, a standard by which all other psychologies are measured. Sikolohiyang Pilipino accepts its scientific nature but challenges its universality. Alternative perspectives from non Western psychologies, according to Enriquez, should be used. With proper respect to Asian experience and views, the history of psychology must be reinterpreted. It endeavors to discover universals by promoting cross cultural perspectives. Sikolohiyang Pilipino also believes in the use of psychology to help with the development of a national culture that is Western dominated yet takes into account Filipino aspirations. Sikolohiyang Pilipino contributes to universal psychology founded on a new set of principles: diversity and equality. Diversity is based on various countries' and cultures' experiences and unique characteristics. Equality accepts all psychologies as equally valid, vital, and relevant, and does not try to push its belief on others. It tries to test hypotheses based on Western theories and produce its theories and body of knowledge to understand and uncover its own particularities. Sikolohiyang Pilipino has long been at the forefront of expressing and explaining new concepts and approaches that are irrelevant not only to Filipinos but also to other Asian civilizations.
Western academics tend to be inadequate and unfair in their assessments and approaches to psychology. This is evident in their harsh judgments of Filipinos regarding the different values of our people, and their failure to incorporate and consider the indirect way of Filipino communication. The colonization of psychology is an important step in the process of the development of national identity and consciousness. More and more Filipinos are recognizing Filipino traits, such as the brown skin, as observed in commercials throughout these years. The decolonization of the Filipino mentality is an arduous but persisting endeavor after centuries. As Sikolohiyang Pilipino tackles the social-cultural elements of Filipinos and is understood from a Filipino perspective, the subject is more relevant in addressing problems in the Philippines. Not only does Sikolohiyang Pilipino highlight Filipino elements on par with Western concepts, it also brings indigenous culture to light from more dominating and modern themes. This validates Filipino identity to the world, and more importantly, this validates indigenous culture and tradition to contemporary Philippine society. This ends our report on Sikolohiyang